My name is Professor Susan Rasmussen. I'm Professor of Anthropology and Comparative Cultural Studies here at the University of Houston. And Professor Gordon asked me to speak on the topic generally of cultural constructions of gender, and also I'll be including a case study from my research, which has been in Tuareg communities of northern Niger and northern Mali. My general research interests, in addition to gender, involve religion, the life cycle, or the life course, symbolic anthropology, healing systems, specifically Medico, what are called Medico ritual healing ceremonies, such as spirit possession, and also, quite often I'm interested also in verbal art performance. Before proceeding, in keeping with the general topic, the cultural construction of gender, which I am discussing here, I shall begin with a basic insight from Anthropology of Gender Studies, which I am certain for many of you will be a reminder more than a revelation. But very briefly, I think we need to remind ourselves here of the idea that we all live in worlds of symbols that assign meaning and value to the categories of male and female. For example, just think of the example in our own culture, first of all, in the United States. Many cartoons and toys are still usually targeted either for little girls or little boys. And they're often packaged appropriately in colors and materials that are culturally defined as either feminine or masculine, for example, pink or blue. And this cultural construction of gender, as opposed to the biological foundation of sex, really can be summed up in a still very current distinction, I believe, that is conventional to make in gender studies. And this is a distinction between sex and gender. Sex is basically the way you're born, chromosomally, hormonally. And gender is basically what you think you are, psychologically, culturally, and socially. For example, just a brief elaboration here. Among the Tuareg people of Niger, where I've conducted extensive research, this is a Tamasha-speaking group in the Saharan regions of northern Mali and northern Niger. It is men who wear the face veil, not women. Men tend to wear this on an everyday basis. It has to do with cultural constructions of male gender roles, which involve a value of modesty and respect shown by men towards others. Women, on the other hand, tend not to be veiled completely in everyday social life, only on several occasions, for example, during some ritual healing sessions and in various phases of their weddings. But in everyday life, it's Tuareg men who wear the veil, as this picture on the cover of my second book conveys. Okay, so, in other words, the biological categories of male and female are foundations upon which culturally defined and culturally appropriate gender constructs, roles, identities, and expectations are constructed by both men and women in any society. I have one more picture from a different culture just to give you another illustration of this. This picture is from a group called the Fulani, who also live, they're neighbors of the Tuareg in Mali and Niger. And in this particular group of a more nomadic Fulani community, men, notice, are wearing makeup. And this is not considered effeminate there. This is considered perfectly, this is one of the expectations in the cultural constructions of male gender roles there. In fact, this is a scene from a particular ceremony called Garawal, which is a male beauty contest. So this is masculine behavior. But to return to the main topic here and then proceed to my case study, which will be from my research in Tuareg communities in northern Niger predominantly. Now, these expectations concerning gender are not only culturally constructed, but they're also at times politically and economically constructed. That is, they often cross-cut other contexts such as one's class identity, one's ethnic identity, one's socioeconomic position, one's religion, and one's position in the life course. And in addition, finally, these cultural constructions of gender are very often expressed through symbol and ritual. Now, in gender studies, many scholars have explored both similarities and differences. That is, they have sought both universals and cultural variations pertaining to gender and relations between the sexes among the different peoples of the world. For example, several theorists have addressed questions such as the following. Are women universally subordinate and men universally dominant in all societies? And if so, if this is true, which is by no means agreed upon, then how and why? Now, one arena in which this issue has been examined is in the domain of religious ritual, in particular in the context of what is called Medico ritual healing ceremonies. For example, many studies of African societies have revealed that the ritual life of women there is both significant for women's power and also highly elaborated symbolically. In many African societies, and even beyond, for example, women are involved in complex ceremonies such as spirit possession, divination, mediumship, and serve as important healing practitioners in these capacities. These are often involve what we call altered states of consciousness. That is, a state of consciousness that is believed to occur when someone is in communication with some kind of being that is beyond human social life. For example, a soul or spirits or ancestors. Now, these specialists frequently transcend local cultural definitions of womanhood, and they are often recognized as having extraordinary characteristics in some way. Okay, now, in a range of different cultural contexts, many anthropologists have argued that women use much medico ritual healing. For example, what is known as spirit possession and mediumship, involving altered states. They use these ceremonies, many anthropologists have argued, in part, at least, to compensate for what some theorists assume to be women's material deprivation and political subordination to men, and also to compensate perhaps for what is presumed to be their exclusion from participation in more established or organized religions, such as Islam or Christianity or Buddhism. Just to give a few examples, in his early classic work, I.M. Lewis studied possession ceremonies called Zar in Somalia. And he argued here that possession, being predominantly by females and other marginal persons, was an important way women compensated for not participating in some other more mainstream forms of religious and political life. Now, since this time, this theory of altered states, that is, altered states involving trance, which is defined as possession or mediumship, meaning it's defined as possession and communication by and with a spirit. Since this time, many other scholars have critiqued this theory. Spirit possession especially has become understood as more complex, particularly in terms of its relationships between the cultural construction of gender, gender expectations, and religion in the wider society. For example, in many societies, women can become possessed for a variety of reasons that don't always involve subordination or deprivation. And this brings me to my case study that is based on my work from Tuareg communities in northern Niger and Mali, in which altered states of consciousness, at least those that occur in public possession, exorcism, healing rituals, tend to be dominated by women. Okay, now, I found that spirit possession in northern Niger among the Tuareg certainly has to do with gendered expectations. For example, many Tuareg will tell you that women tend to become possessed more often than men because perhaps they have a hidden love that they can't express openly. Perhaps they disagree with their parents about an arranged marriage choice. However, Tuareg women, we must be careful here because spirit possession does not always represent, in the Tuareg case at least, resistance for women, because Tuareg women are very far from deprived. They're not subordinate to men. For example, many of them enjoy independent property ownership. They may initiate divorce. Many of them are also socially prestigious, and men will tell you they respect women. Okay, so the broader point here I wish to take off from is that we've paid quite a bit of attention to spirit possession. Some argue that it is indeed a form of resistance. In cases of female possession in particular, others disputing this claim and identifying more complexities among the relations between gender, religion, and possession. Less attention, however, has been paid to cases in which women in a society where female possession is prevalent do not, in fact, go on to undertake spirit possession rituals. So I'm going to approach this from a slightly different angle here, almost mischievously. What I'm going to do in this case study is analyze the case of a woman who, in fact, although she entered a kind of an altered state, that is, she dreamed of a spiritual being, she did not, in fact, go on to undergo the spirit possession rituals. And I'm going to analyze exactly what the implications of this were, more broadly, for the connections between gender, possession, and these wider issues. Okay, now, in Anthropology of Religion and Gender, as observed, much attention has been devoted to the connections between altered states, that is transpossession, and organized, that is scriptural or textual established religion, especially in female spirit possession and mediumship, and in particular in Muslim societies, for example, in relation to Islam and the Quran. Now, in this case study, I'm going to explore the relationship between altered states of consciousness, featuring the soul, spirits, and ancestors, and gender, and local cultural interpretations of Islam in the Sahara, in communities of Tuareg. This is going to be a slightly different perspective because I'm going to emphasize here a widowed Tuareg woman's visitational dream by a spiritual being that did not, contrary to the usual outcome, lead to a spirit possession ceremony. Now, the setting of this particular topic of research was a rural community in a Tamashek-speaking Muslim, semi-nomadic, and socially stratified Tuareg community, most of whom today are really what we call agro-pastoralists. That is, they combine livestock herding with oasis gardening in the Ayer Mountains of northern Niger. Now, this woman's dream was interpreted by an Islamic scholar, that is, an Islamic scholar, predominantly men, who interpret verses from the Quran and sometimes heal with them. This was interpreted by an Islamic scholar as a visit not by a spirit of the wild that required a possession exorcism ceremony. Rather, it was interpreted by this Islamic scholar as a soul of this woman's deceased spouse. That is, he interpreted her dream as being a visit by the woman's deceased spouse. And in this woman's dream, the spouse the Islamic scholar said, was conveying sacred instructions to conduct a Quranic commemorative condolence ritual. And these condolence rituals are called takite, also a term for alms or offerings in Tamashek, the language of the Tuareg. Now, the outcome of this dream, commemoration of the dead, recall, is only one of several possible paths taken by dreamers of spiritual beings in Tuareg society. Because dreaming, in fact, is one form of an altered state, okay? So, other possible paths include possession exorcism rituals and mediumistic divination careers. These are other possibilities. Islamic scholars, in fact, often diagnose possession and often counsel spirit possession exorcism rites in cases of depression caused by, for example, what they identify as non-Quranic kalasuf spirits of the wild or solitude. So, these are spirits of solitude or the wild, and this woman's dream was not, in fact, diagnosed by the Islamic scholar to be caused by an occupying kalasuf spirit of the wild. Rather, he had diagnosed it, as I said, as caused by the soul of her deceased husband, who wanted her to hold a special mainstream Islamic commemoration rite. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm going to analyze how this outcome was shaped by the psychosocial needs of the dreamer, as well as religious and culturally gendered practices. And I argue here that these processes cannot be reduced to either resistance or acquiescence to established Quranic Islam in that community. In other words, the implication in many possession studies is that you become possessed, and in so doing, you somehow are resisting something. Therefore, becoming possessed and undergoing public possession rituals is often interpreted as, in fact, constituting active agency on the part of the persons in the altered state. Therefore, by implication, not becoming possessed tends to be viewed, when it is studied, and which is not often, it tends to be viewed, as not being as resistant or actively agentive. Well, I'm arguing here that, in fact, you have to look beyond this kind of theory about possession and examine very carefully each case of people who, in fact, undergo altered states and do not become regular participants in the possession ceremony, and withhold judgment about whether or not they are resisting anything. And we'll see exactly what the implications of this are. Now, Tuareg, who are predominantly Muslims, also retain lingering rituals and cosmologies predating Islam. And my approach here, therefore, includes comparing and contrasting possession, mediumship, and dreaming, which are related yet distinct altered states. Therefore, I find them mutually illuminating here. In Niger, particularly the north, more nomadic part of Niger, local interpretations of Islam and more universalistic Quranic law, medicine, and rituals mutually influence, but at times also collide with each other. Local Tuareg residents there vary much in their religious devotion, but they include many highly respected, influential clans of Islamic scholars, some of whom claim descent from the Prophet Muhammad. Therefore, categories such as pre-Islamic or para-Islamic or popular Islamic or even Islamist and Quranic are not always discrete, mutually exclusive categories. Now, since their conversion to Islam by Sufi Marabout, between approximately the 8th and the 11th centuries CE, that is current era, formerly called AD, the Tuareg have attempted to reconcile more universalistic pan-Islamic calls for equality of all believers with more long-standing local social stratification. Also, they've tried to reconcile Islamic monotheism, that is belief in one God, Allah, with their older spirit pantheons, for example, specifically matrilineal spirit pantheons, and also with their traditional medical ritual healing systems, such as possession, mediumship, divination. Also, there are potential conflicts, but also compromises often between Quranic Arabic and secular state-derived patrilineal legal systems which favor male heirs on the one hand, and earlier Tuareg matrilineal mythico histories and inheritance systems which favor females. So we have a series we have some conflict but also some compromises here between the different religious traditions, especially in relation to gender. Despite regional class and rural-urban variations, there's generally very free social interaction between the sexes. Most Tuareg women, for example, may initiate divorce. They can travel, visit unrelated males and receive unrelated male visitors even after they get married. And they enjoy rather high social prestige, most of them. And often also they inherit independently property and manage this property independently. For example, livestock herds has been their chief principal form of wealth until quite recently. There are also special endowments that are reserved for sisters, daughters, and nieces that protect their property and attempt to counterbalance the Quranic inheritance bias toward males. On the other hand, relations between the sexes are changing recently from the impact of settled oasis and town life, from massive refugee flight, from droughts, from livestock devastation, and from upheavals in sporadic armed Tuareg rebellions against central state governments of Mali and Niger. Many men are also bringing home alien cultural values concerning gender constructs when they return from distant labor migration or political exile. And most recently of all, the war in Libya has repelled at least 50,000 migrants and refugees into northern Niger to escape the violence there. So, dilemmas and disputes inevitably arise, not surprisingly, over certain cases of ambiguous inheritance, bride wealth, divorce, and other issues. And there's some rivalry as well as complementarity between diviner healers inspired by matrilineally based rituals, such as female herbalism and spirit possession, and non-Quranic spirits possessing them, on the one hand, and predominantly male Islamic scholars who are inspired by the Quran. So we have, some complementarity and cooperation between these different specialists, but there's also some rivalry. Yet, this dream of this woman, the widow, whose husband had died very far away from her, and its aftermath and outcome, suggests that despite some power struggles, these forces are not in every respect opposed or hierarchical. And hopefully, I think these Tuareg data, offer alternatives to either extreme of conflict or accommodation models of relations between mainstream and local religious practice and gender. So my broader goal here is to critically reassess some prevalent, although not unanimous, anthropological positions on altered states, especially female spirit possession, which tend to view them, recall, as either outright resistance or outright accommodation to state-sponsored, organized ritual religion. Some studies, as observed, have portrayed mainstream religion as controlled by men or some hegemonic elite who attempt, with varying success, to impose so-called official religion upon so-called marginalized persons. Now, this perspective, can imply that non-possession is not oppositional, or at least not beneficial or agentive or active. Okay, in other words, it can imply that not becoming possessed shows some kind of passivity. Other studies of possession in Africa have questioned older models of universal meanings and causes of altered states. Yet many studies still tend to argue generally in terms of two opposing poles, that much female spirit possession represents resistance or accommodation to established or mainstream religion, and many tend to still situate altered states generally as either peripheral to or in opposition to or on the edge of some religious center. And this view echoes old center-periphery models, for example, in world systems theories, and implies that mainstream religion is monolithic. So I find this case an interesting opportunity to offer more nuanced insights into these connections and into these questions. So the connections between possession, gender, and local interpretations of Islam and the Quran remain particularly problematic here. In the Ayer Mountain communities in rural northern Niger, among Tuareg communities there are indeed gendered patterns to altered states. Predominantly women undergo musical rituals in public that exercise possessing non-Quranic Kelesuf spirits of the wild. Both men and women may obtain spirit contracts that enables them to practice non-Quranic dream-based divination and mediumship and to heal others, giving them advice, for example, or predicting the future. But only male Islamic scholars practice Quranic dream-based divination. Only men suffer from illnesses called the illnesses of God, or the illnesses of Allah, and these are from Quranic spirit attacks believed to take place in mosques, explained as resulting from too much earnest recitation of praise verses before the man is fully prepared to do so. So these gendered patternings to possession are significant, but nevertheless, they don't yield neat correlations or oppositions. For Tuareg disagree on the reasons for these patterns, their wider significance, and there are also exceptions to them. So what I'm trying to do here is to escape circular arguments and binary either-or conclusions about altered states in relation to Islam. And this woman's dream motif of the soul of her deceased husband and its outcome reveal a negotiation of this relationship. In Tuareg society, more devout Muslims assert that all the Quran contains medicine. Each Quranic verse is a treatment for an illness or problem, including some caused by spirits. Majnun, Arabic denoting crazy, also denotes possessed by jinn beings. In fact, even in Arabia, it was widely believed that poets, diviners, and soothsayers each had a familiar spirit, which at times enabled the possessed to give prophetic or poetic utterances. And perhaps even the prophet himself at first feared he might be jinn possessed. Now, among the Tuareg, who are not Arabs, although they share the Islamic religion, keep that in mind, the culture imposes local cultural interpretations upon religion. And these interpretations are often influenced by, and in turn influence, gender constructs in the local culture and society. So among the Tuareg, there are similar efforts to discern the moral source of insights from altered states, such as possession, mediumship, and dreams. And there are efforts to ensure that their messages are legitimate and come from good, not evil sources. So many Tuareg, again similarly to the Arabians, also associate creativity, for example, poetry, with altered states, specifically the wild, which also denotes solitude or nostalgia. Rather than equating all spirit possession with insanity, or categorically linking altered states to malevolent spirits or the devil, many Tuareg distinguish between permanent insanity, possession that requires exorcism rituals, and mediums' contracts with spirits, enabling careers in divination. And Islamic scholars who dream, divine, and heal jinn with verses of the Quran recognize that some spirits of the wild are not Quranic and resist Quranic remedies. That is, Quranic verses they admit can't cure them and require exorcism or a longer term pact for cure. So the point is there are internally diverse rather than monolithic narratives here. I think at this point I'll show you a couple of, if I can find it on here. Let's see. Yes. Okay, I'm going to show you a few pictures for your interest that illustrate some of these different healing specialties. Here is a picture of an Islamic scholar. Note how the man there is wearing a veil, and this is an Islamic scholar. Remember, Tuareg men wear veil, not women, at least not permanently. And he's treating a woman in a sort of a psychosocial, what we would consider a psychiatric consultation. And I'll show you a couple of pictures from possession, the possession ritual as well. Here's a scene from the spirit possession ritual many women in Tuareg society do undergo, that is, if they're referred to a spirit possession practitioner by an Islamic scholar who can't heal them with Quranic verses. And this woman, note, is in fact wearing a veil, but this is a very particular circumstance. It's exceptional in Tuareg society. She only wears a veil during the possession ritual and during a certain phase of her wedding. And there you see one phase in the altered state of possession in which he is dancing, believed to be occupied by the spirit. And here, I'm including this photo because it illustrates very well a female diviner medium who also practices professional herbalism, gathering her medicines from a tree that is believed to, in addition, yield very important medicine for treatments, also to house matrilineal spirits with whom she has a sort of a contract or a pact. Thank you. Okay. Now, so the point is, there are a lot of internally diverse rather than monolithic or single healing narratives here, and not all are shared by everyone. And altered states provide spaces, in other words, on reflecting on these different voices and narratives. Now, I think I need to say a brief word here before proceeding about the analysis of dreams. And this also is an altered state, keep in mind, because many women's possessions, no matter what kind of spirit, tends to start out with a dream of some sort, often combined with some kind of what we would call a depression, although not always. Okay, well, there are challenges to analyzing dreams cross-culturally, and the problem is that the anthropologist only has access to other dreams through narratives. Obviously, we can't directly observe a dream. We don't learn much even from brainwaves on a graph. And as Dennis Tedlock has pointed out, while dreaming itself is private, dream sharing is interactive, and it necessarily happens after the dream is over. So there are some challenges here to interpreting exactly how Tana felt about her own dream. But we're going to do our best here with the ethnographic evidence and extrapolate. Like many visitational dreams, this Tuareg woman's soul dream, and I'm going to give her a pseudonym to protect her personal identity. I'll call her Tana, which is not her real name. This does resemble possession. For example, in such dreams, dreamers enter a trance-like state while sleeping, in which many Tuareg believe they're very vulnerable to character change. And it's widely believed that the soul travels during sleep. Hence the importance of guidance and counseling, which in Tuareg society usually occurs in private with an Islamic scholar prior to deciding what ceremony is more appropriate for the woman or the other possessed person. Now in this case, I find, in dream counseling by the Islamic scholar, there basically were three voices speaking. One voice was that of Tana, the woman dreamer. Another voice was that of her deceased husband. And then there was that of the Islamic scholar. Now this process, I show, involves memory, a rite of passage, and a kind of a pilgrimage, although a figurative rather than a literal pilgrimage. And all of these aim to reconcile the different religious and healing practices in Tuareg society in terms of gender as well. So, the important question I find here is not so much whether or not this dreamer is resisting or accommodating Islam. Rather, what is important in my view is that the woman dreamer's reasons for accepting the Islamic scholar's interpretation and for participating in his prescribed ritual, the mainstream Islamic takote, or commemorative rite of the dead. In other words, one must ask, wherein resides the power of this belief for this particular dreamer? How does she benefit? And how does this dreamer herself define empowerment and agency? So, the woman I shall call Tana here, a bit of background is instructive. She belongs to a socially respected, prominent, but impoverished aristocratic and chiefly clan, which includes many Islamic scholars, predominantly men, who inherit Quranic healing and divining powers as descendants of the Prophet. Now, a smaller group in her clan also traces descent matrilineally from a female ancestress who founded the local specialty of herbal medicine, and herbal medicine women sometimes also divine and have spirit contracts, as I observed. Now, Tana was very respected, but she was of very modest means, with very few livestock left from herds devastated by droughts in the region and also stolen during wars in the region. Now, her husband fell ill and tragically died very suddenly while he was gone on salt and date caravans between Bilma, Niger, and Kano, Nigeria. And his death and burial far from home caused Tana great pain. So, several months later, she dreamed of her deceased husband, who was now an immediate, personalized, traced patrilineal ancestor to her children, but not yet a distant ancestor. And these latter beings, that is, distant ancestors, are called by a separate term, meaning people of the past, and they overlap with, but they're not identical to, non-Quranic Kelasib spirits of the wild, and also Quranic jinn spirits. All these beings pose a contradiction to the monolithic Islamic Allah, which needs to be resolved. An Islamic scholar interpreted her dream, recall, by sleeping with Quranic verses beneath his pillow, and he interpreted as follows: your husband's soul, in Tamashek called Iman, has been communicating his wish for you to spiritually bring his soul back home here. Because he died so far away, you have to sacrifice one goat, and you have to hold a memorial condolence meal with almsgiving prayers and Quranic readings. Now, these communal condolence meals, although they demand usually one sacrifice from the bereaved person, normally compensate that person both materially and psychosocially, because others attending this ritual also make contributions. Not only are there collective prayers led from the Quran, but participants will also bring additional food dishes to contribute. Therefore, this constitutes an important source of psychological comfort. It also offers a widening of the person's social networks, not to mention providing some material compensation in food. Now, Tana went ahead and arranged this ritual, and she eventually married one of the presiding marabouts, becoming his second co-wife in polygyny. Now, significantly, she consulted an Islamic scholar to interpret her dream. And recall, he interpreted her dream as a visiting figure of her deceased husband, but not a spirit. Okay, why exactly? Well, the answer here is not as obvious as it might appear. For in Tuareg communities, even women in Islamic scholar clans sometimes come possessed, and a few even obtain long-term spirit contracts which enable them to practice divination and mediumship careers. Also, recall, marabouts often diagnose persons suffering, like Tana, from loss, loneliness, and unrequited love as caused by spirits of the wild, and refer them to the public possession rituals. So, why didn't this happen in this case? You have to examine some of the practices in alternatives open to Tana to fully understand her decision here. For example, many non-Quranic diviners and mediums who obtain long-term contracts with the spirits have to periodically give them offerings. And they have to go way out into the wild to gather their special medicines. Now, Tana belonged to a very prestigious family, and she had to be very careful of her conduct in widowhood. But recall, she was also impoverished, and she didn't have many resources. And some of these diviner mediums, in embarking on a career in divination, find that they're unable to complete their long-term obligations to the spirits, to their tutelary spirits. And in those cases, disaster often results. For example, they may bring misfortune onto their families may become impoverished. Very often, their obligations compete with their domestic responsibilities and drain them economically, particularly in cases where they are not very well-to-do, as Tana was not very well-to-do. Tana basically skipped some of these alternative practices and underwent the Takote ritual. And this was, in her case, not really an irrational or passive decision. Rather, it was quite rational and logical when one considers the context, her position, her situation at that time. And although many Tuareg women oppose polygyny traditionally, for example, many of them divorce a husband once he contracts a marriage to a co-wife, that is a polygynous marriage, recently more Tuareg women, especially widows in Niger's rural area mountains, are remarrying polygynous men since they lack sufficient livestock herds to support themselves as single women. Or if they prefer to practice long-term divining mediumship careers, they tend to run out of resources to offer their tutelary spirit husbands. And furthermore, most recently, it has become very dangerous to go out into the wild, that is into the middle of the desert, and gather medicines alone because of the intermittent political violence, the wars in northern Niger and Mali. So, Tana, I think the important point here is that Tana was considering her life situation and long-term consequences not as a passive victim. Rather, she displayed a certain logic and caution here. Yet there's more at play here. Illness, possession, divining, and dreaming are opportunities for moral inquiry. And upon diagnosis of possession by Kelas of spirits, public musical exorcism rituals are conducted by drummers and singers. And during the spirit possession exorcism ritual, their song verses often express both critical social commentary and calls for reintegration of the person into society. For example, they may try to reconcile the possessed person in trance to culturally constructed role expectations. Therefore, possession exorcisms, it's important to realize, vary in their outcomes, and they don't always result in resistance. In fact, in one case, the chorus of singers during one possession exorcism ritual of a possessed adolescent woman whose love affair, opposed by her parents, resulted in an illegitimate child, basically urged her to honor her parents' preference in an arranged marriage to a man other than her love preference. So the song verses in this situation of possession counseled that particular woman in the altered state to forget her lover and accept her parents' choice. So the point here is that possession rituals do not always convey rebellion or lead to empowerment or overturning the status quo for the person in the altered state, that is, the person in trance who is possessed. Just as not becoming possessed does not necessarily always convey passive acquiescence or lack of agency.